Check mic 1 2. Hopefully you can all hear me. I am seeing my audio go through, so I'm guessing you can all hear me. Check. Okay. I would assume that you could hear me. If not, I could type in the chat window. That way I could see and I can make some modifications. Welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Today's topic is actually a presentation that I did for the Microsoft Data Platform Business Continuity Virtual Chapter. Man, the name is long, but it's something that I did last year for the virtual chapter, and we were having some conversations around the topics, and we wanted to go back to the basics. And this topic was the one that I presented, and it is a byproduct or result of working with customers for the past about 15 years now, or working in the HA and DR space for the past 15 years, and for the past 10 years or so working with customers who are implementing high availability and disaster recovery solutions, particularly in the Microsoft SQL Server space. And the topic of today's conversation is the 3 reasons why focusing on tech is the worst way. Yes, I did say that is the worst way to deploy a SQL Server HADR solution. And I'm gonna be doing this a little bit different. I'll be sharing my screen. This is more of like a presentation, like I said, something that I did a year ago for the Microsoft virtual chapter, the Data Platform Business Continuity group. So hopefully you can see my screen the minute I share it. Let me share. See, that's the thing about this. Share screen. There we are. All right. So the 3 reasons why focusing on tech is the worst way to deploy a SQL Server HADR solution, or HADR solution in the general sense. It does not have to be SQL Server, but anything that is high availability and disaster recovery. And whenever I do presentations, I like telling stories to set the stage of the entire presentation. So back in 2008, man, it's been almost 14 years now. In 2008, my family and I decided to move to the beautiful city of Ottawa. And coming from a tropical country, there are only 2 seasons that I know, the wet and the dry season. And so this is our very first opportunity to experience a totally different season from what I have gotten used to. And so we were ready to, I want to say venture out on, but we were ready and prepared to because when we moved here back in November, so that's transitioning from fall to winter, and we were getting ready for the winter season. And mind you, I already have an idea of the different seasons here in North America, particularly the Northeast. And the thing about these seasons is that you have to be well dressed. I heard a saying before, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing or inappropriate clothing for the season. So we kind of prepared for that. I was ready for the winter. We got here during the winter. It was cold. We had snow. And then spring, and then summer. Of course, summer is something that we already know coming from a tropical country. And then fall, right? I'm so not going to burst into that James Taylor song about the wind. No, I'm not. In case you're thinking. So I got myself ready for the winter. Winter coats on, sweaters. Back then, I didn't have snow boots, but I was gearing up for it. And the one thing that I did not anticipate is how much snow we were getting. And so I started looking at ways on how to clear up snow on our driveway. And mind you, this is not like your 1 inch, 2 inches of snow. We are getting, on average, the worst one, we were having like 3 or 4 feet of snow when a snowstorm hits. And so, you know how it is when you need something and you're looking for tools that could help you make life easy for you. In my case, I was looking for snowblowers, particularly. snowblowers. And the rabbit hole searches would send me through different websites that would feature all of these capabilities of snowblowers. Where you, and in fact, this was one video that I saw on YouTube. Well, this was latest, but there was one video that I saw on YouTube that demonstrates the different features of a specific snowblower. Like, for instance, how you can have the dual LED headlights in case you decide to clear snow on your driveway at 3 o'clock in the morning. You definitely need those LED headlights just so you have a clear vision of what you're about to do in case 3 o'clock in the morning. Heated hand grips, that way you can feel your hand so warm whenever you're trying to shovel snow with a snowblower, in case you forgot to put on your winter gloves, in case. And then you have this one-touch electric chute control, kind of like robotic style, where you can redirect where the chute would throw the snow away. Definitely not your neighbors, somewhere that is away from you and your neighbors. And then you have your in-dash remote pitch control, where sometimes, you know, these iPad or touchscreen type controls. But then you kind of wonder, if I have winter gloves, how do I get in control, or I can do touchscreen of these in-dash remote pitch control, and sometimes the automated robotic. Again, the point that I'm making here is there's so many of these features that I can take advantage of just by looking at a snowblower. The challenge here is that, you know, this is very similar to when we're deploying a high availability and disaster recovery solution. Like I said, this could be for any type of high availability and or disaster recovery solution. It does not have to be SQL Server. It could be anything that you decide to use for your high availability or disaster recovery solution. The thing is, features have always been the central focus. In fact, every time a new version of SQL Server is being announced, like for instance SQL Server 2022 now is available for a public preview. You can download the CTP, and whenever a new feature is, or rather whenever a new version is being released, the features are the highlight. And if you look at the timeline here, like 2008, when Microsoft introduced, well, failover clustering, log shipping, and database mirroring have been there since the earlier versions, but Microsoft would emphasize, yes, these are the features, we have some improvements, right? And then you have availability groups, which was introduced in SQL Server 2012 with the capabilities of having a multi-subnet failover clusters, where you can, of course, that's a Windows feature, where you could stretch your clusters across two different network subnets, and you can run your availability groups on top of it. SQL Server 2014 introduced the capabilities for you to integrate SQL Server on-premises with Azure, and that's where your backup to URL feature comes in, and managed backup to Azure. 2016 introduced the feature to load balance the read-only routing, meaning how your secondary replicas are read by the client applications, and SQL Server taking care of the load balancing workload instead of having your network appliance do that. 2017 introduced the concept of running SQL Server on Linux, or running it on containers. You might be wondering, what is SQL Server on Linux doing there as an HA strategy? As far as I'm concerned, if nobody wants to touch SQL Server because it's on Linux, because they don't know the command line, it's safe from people who may decide to do something else, like power down the machine because they thought it was development. So that's why I put it there. And then 2019, when SQL Server introduced its support for running on Kubernetes. But the point that I'm making here is that throughout the years, whenever a new version is being released, Microsoft, people in the community, speakers, experts, they all focus on the features. Only on the features. Why? It's sexy. It's exciting. People don't get excited. I mean, just look at your latest, I don't have an iPhone. Look at your latest iPhone. Every time an advertisement comes out for the iPhone, it is always about the new feature, better camera, better capability. You know, the Samsung one where you could fold the phone, it's all about the features. Why? Because it is what sells. And the vendors are only concerned about selling. Old features don't sell, right? Now, because of this, people like us, technology professionals, DBAs, sysadmins, service providers, even Microsoft themselves, whenever, and even third-party partners and vendors, they would focus more on the feature of the specific version of SQL Server. And like I said, throughout SQL Server's version release, the features have always been the spotlight. And you can't blame them. We have been trained ever since, if you've gone through computer science programs or IT programs or computer engineering programs, it's all about what can this do. The features themselves have been the focus because that's how we were trained. It's how we've been conditioned. And when you start looking at a new version of a product, like in this case SQL Server, that is the first thing that you start looking for. You know, it's just like a heat-seeking missile. That's the only thing that you would focus on, instead of just exploring how can this actually help me. In the past, I spent so much time on Microsoft forums, news groups, online communities, and I took this screenshot of a question. It says, I have this requirement to implement always-on availability groups with automatic failover across data center. I'll stop right there. Every time somebody asks a question like this, the typical response is, please check this blog, always-on available groups with multi-subnet failover cluster. Hope this could help you. And I'm not here to point out what Kathy from Microsoft Forums did wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. In fact, she led the person asking the question to the right direction in finding the technical answer to a technical question. But the thing about this is, we have been conditioned to always focus on the tech. Anytime you get brought into a high availability or disaster recovery conversation, let's say you're about to deploy a new HA solution for a platform, and the first thing that comes to mind is, how do we do this? And that's where your focus shifts on the features immediately, right? And I like this quote from Henry David Thoreau that says, men have become the tools of their tools. I'll use this very simple thing. Of course, the thing about that is we're focusing on the wrong things. Our focus immediately goes to the features and the tools. That's because we were trained to do that, okay? We have been conditioned, education, the vendors, people around us, technical experts, have conditioned us to focus on the features and the tools. That's why I started off this presentation by saying, it's the worst thing. 3 reasons or 3 things why focusing on tech is the worst thing when you deploy an HADR solution. It took me some time to look for this picture, and I want you to look at this picture. What do you notice? And I want you to type it in the chat section or in the comment section. What do you notice when you see this picture? And of course, I hinted that this was an ad in, I think it was in Latin America, and this was designed to keep your focus on one thing. In fact, this was also part of a social experiment that the brand, in this case, Colgate, did. But it is an attempt to demonstrate that if people led you to focus on one thing, you immediately put your focus on that and then ignore the things that are important. And so if you ask me, going back to those times when I was looking for a snowblower, how good are all of these features if, well, I'm barely here during the winter. We would travel, visit family most of the time. So how good is that snowblower with all the bells and whistles if I'm not even here to use the snowblower? Hence, like I said, focusing on the tech is the worst thing, or is the worst way to deploy a SQL Server HA solution. And I wanted to point out three things. In fact, these three things form part of the framework that I use every time I embark on an HADR solution. When you focus on tech, right, and like I said, what good are these features if they don't meet your needs? I'm gone most of the time during the winter. Well, the pandemic changed all of that. But if you're not even able to use these features because they don't meet your needs, what good are they? And I wanted to share three things that have become the framework of how I deal with HA and DR solutions. But I also wanted to emphasize, if you focus more on the tech, you tend to bypass people. Bypassing people simply means that your efforts, your focus, your investments are all going to be on the tech and not looking at the people resource. I'm a big fan of empowering people first, because the people will find a way to solve a tech problem. And I intentionally used hockey as the picture for this. I don't really play hockey, but we're in Canada, so we're going to roll with it. For one, staff availability. If you are going to deploy a very complex high availability or disaster recovery solution, how sure are you that there are people on the team who would be available to support it? Well, even before supporting it, who would be available to deploy it, to implement it, and to support it. Keep in mind, this is a high availability solution that needs to be up and running 24/7. You need somebody, not one person, you need somebody who can take care of this 24/7. And that's not a one-person thing. I always emphasize that high availability solutions is not a one-man sport. It's a team sport. And you don't expect one person to be on call 24/7, taking care of this and not going on vacations, not going on sick days, not going on weekends, because they're people. Team capabilities and skills. Like I said, before you embark on a high availability solution, how sure are you that the people who would support this down the road are capable enough with the skills, with the capabilities, to know what to do when they need to do it? Like, for instance, an outage at 3 o'clock in the morning, how capable is your team to deal with that kind of outage? Motivation. I've seen developers, and literally developers. These were developers who know a little bit about SQL Server, and now they're taking care of their high availability solution. What is the motivation of somebody who was forced to do something versus somebody who volunteered because he wanted to learn the technology? I'm pretty sure that the person who was voluntold, who was forced to do this, would not be as motivated as the person who took this as part of his responsibility because he wanted to learn it. What about individual career goals? Like I said, I've seen database developers who moved from taking care of application code to now being the DBA because nobody understood what availability groups are or how high availability solutions work. And now he was forced to do it. And he does not want to do that. He wants to become a developer. He wants to spend time working on code. He won't be motivated if that is not part of his career goal. And similarly, personalities. People who wanted to do 24/7 operations are not necessarily the same person who wants to focus on building or deploying. Like, the engineering team is totally different from the operations team because they have different personalities. The DBA team has different personalities. The people in there has different personalities than the people in the sysadmin team or the network team. And these are the things that you have to consider, because you're not just building an HA solution without people involved. And of course, I'm going to throw in their budget, because part of that is not just about the money that you're going to invest for licensing, for the deployment of technology. You are also going to factor in availability of human resource. If you start adding, let's say you start adding replicas to an existing availability group, are you adding more people on your staff to take care of this? Like I said, a high availability solution is not a one-man sport. It has to be a team sport where you're rotating on-call assignments so that one person does not get burned out by doing, yes, I talk about burnout in the context of being on-call because I hated it. That's one reason I'm no longer doing on-call assignments, right? That's why you have to focus on people. And I want to use this example of a client from way back 2017. They were a software as a service company that they were providing financial services, and they wanted to do a data center migration, but did not want to buy enterprise edition licenses. And this is a typical scenario. They wanted to migrate, but they don't want to spend on licenses. And they gave me kind of like an overview of their existing architecture. They wanted to move from SQL Server 2012, and they're on standard edition, right? Database mirroring. You kind of wonder, why are they using database mirroring in SQL Server 2012? Well, it was only deprecated. It doesn't mean it's not supported. Microsoft still officially supports database mirroring. So this is what they have, and they want to move from this to an always-on availability group with SQL Server 2019 because, well, they are thinking, well, if Microsoft claims it is deprecated, we might as well move away from it. But they still want to keep the reporting databases with transactional replication, and they were explaining how they want to transition from their existing infrastructure with database mirroring to always-on availability groups and keep this proposed architecture. There was only one question that I asked that got them to really think about this, is that, do you have a full-time DBA? Crickets. Apparently, their existing infrastructure was built by a consultant, and their in-house operational team is the one supporting it. They got me on board because they want to move from database mirroring to always-on availability groups, yet they don't have a full-time DBA. And this is where they really started to evaluate their proposed architecture. They kind of have an idea of what they wanted to do, but then forgot that a full-time DBA needs to be taking care of this. Well, they do have an operational staff, but their operational staff, their operational engineers, they don't have a clue about always-on availability groups. All they knew was how to work with SQL Server. They're not even officially full-time junior SQL Server DBAs because they're taking care of other operational issues as well as part of their day-to-day. So they barely touch SQL Server in their day-to-day job. It's mostly about taking care of the entire environment, including the application layer. So this one question alone got them to reevaluate. Maybe the new architecture is something that they think that would solve their problem. But if they don't have a full-time DBA on staff to take care of this, they're going to be in big trouble. Because when an outage happens and nobody on their team knows how to deal with it, then it is going to take much longer to deal with an outage. In fact, one of the things that this is one of the things that I ask before I even take on a project. How many people on your team knows this? Because I don't want to be a part of your operations team. I will be building something, but then I will hand it over to your team or to their internal IT team, and I want to make sure that they can deal with it. If they can't, they don't have the skills, then nope, we're not going to move forward with it. Okay. The second thing, the second reason why focusing on tech, if you focus more on the tech, you tend to forget the process. I say process, not process, like what most people in Canada say. You tend to forget the process. And I'm huge on processes because it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter if you're the best DBA on the team, you're the best in the world at what you do, you know exactly how to. If you're the only person who knows about this, I mean, going back to the people aspect, then it is not going to work. There is a process involved for when you want to trigger a manual failover to your DR, right? And I use this workflow as a background because, you know, process is more important, and working with the process guarantees that anybody who is going to be a part of this HA solution, part of the operations team, know what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and they have the capabilities and skills to do it, right? Like for instance, defining your RPO, your RTO, and SLA. People get annoyed, and my customers sometimes, especially back then when I spent a lot of time on the, news groups and forums, they would get annoyed when I asked the question, so what's your recovery objective? And they would typically respond with, I don't know, and I'm not supposed to be the one deciding this, it's supposed to be management. True, but then it is your responsibility to guide the business stakeholders to have a definition. What is their recovery objective? Recovery point, recovery time, and SLA. Because these will be the guiding pillars on how you would evolve. And I say evolve because your business, the business will continue to evolve. How you would evolve your operational process. If you don't have a recovery time objective and you have an outage, I can spend time doing nothing and not addressing an outage because there's no defined recovery time objective. Most people would say, oh, we need this to be up and running fast. But what is fast? The analogy that I typically use here is if you don't have a speed limit, how sure are you that you're not overspeeding? In the same way, if you don't have a recovery time objective, how fast is fast? Is that you want the system up and running in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour? In fact, even your backup strategies should be, no, let me rephrase that. Your restore strategies, not your backups, but your restores. Even your restore strategies, because I'm not a big believer in backups, I'm a big believer in making sure that your backups work by actually restoring them. I've been in so many cases where backups are not working. Yes, they've been taking backups for so long, never tested them, and when the time comes that they need to restore them, they don't work. But again, the point here is even your restore strategies should be based on both your recovery point and your recovery time objective. This is part of your process. Invoking disaster recovery. People forget that building a disaster recovery solution is just one part of the entire picture. You need to have documentation in place. And you need to have that documentation written not for the person who built it, but for the person who needs to invoke disaster recovery. Oh, documentation is not enough. You have to make sure that somebody actually went through the documentation, followed every step, invoke the DR, and somebody approving and validating that it works. In reality, though, when somebody invokes DR or when a real disaster strikes, the person who built it or the person who's part of the operational team maintaining it is not necessarily the same person invoking disaster recovery. This reminded me of when we were doing the very first SQL Server Always On Available Groups training class. Somebody who was in the class sent an email and said, I'm bailing out, that's it, disappeared on the first day. And on the second day, was explaining how and apologizing how she needed to bail out. And she said, we heard a hurricane warning. We needed to evacuate, got the kids, got all of the stuff in the car and drove up north. They're based in Florida. And the thing is, the reality about disasters, specifically natural disasters, the person will be more concerned about their own safety and not worrying about, do I need to fail over the node to the, no, they don't really care about that. And the person who would invoke the disaster recovery procedure will be either on the other side of the country or on the other side of the world. And most of the time, they haven't even seen the disaster recovery process. So make sure that you have included the process of invoking disaster recovery in it, right? BCP, how prepared are you when we need to invoke your business continuity? This was an eye-opener for me when I was working as a data center engineer, because in Singapore, we barely experienced earthquakes. We were on, I think we were on the 5th or 7th floor, and then all of a sudden we felt an earthquake. We're not supposed to use the elevator, or so we started going down the stairs. And a few minutes after we were now okay to go back to the building, the director of the business unit finally said, we need to rewrite our BCP, or our business continuity plan. We have not experienced anything like this. We need to be prepared. So 2 weekends later, everybody was told, stay at home. We will test our BCP. Of course, nobody's in the office, but we need to, let's say we assume that there was an earthquake and our office was destroyed. How do we invoke our BCP? In fact, this entire pandemic gave businesses the opportunity to plan their business continuity. Hopefully they did implement it and tested it, because now everybody's working from home. So if you're not in the data center, if you're not in your office where you can have easy access to the servers and the applications, how would you go about it? Part of that is preparing and planning for business continuity. Issue resolution and escalation. The people aspect, I talked about skills and capabilities. How good are your people? Your level 1 engineers, how good are they with resolving an issue? And how quickly will they be able to escalate in case they couldn't figure out what the problem is? This is something that I ask in my clients before I take them on as customers, is what is your escalation process? Because if you do not have one, how sure are you that you are going to meet your recovery time objective? This escalation procedure, and like I said, typically, the operational team would look at the issue, look at the error message, and then escalate that to level 2. Sometimes not without even looking at what the issue is. They would escalate. Level 2 might have an idea of how it works. They will try to take a stab at it, work on it. What if they couldn't solve the problem? They would escalate to level 3, assuming that you have a level 3. But that is part of the process that you need to take into account when you're dealing with an HA solution. That escalation procedure is part of your service level agreement. If you don't have a service level agreement, again, everybody's shooting in the dark. Your level 2 engineers might be spending forever to try and fix the problem without thinking, oh, I need to escalate this in order for it to be resolved quickly so that we are meeting our service level agreement, right? And setting the expectations. Again, most people would say, I want 0 downtime and 0 data loss. Sure. Until you start putting in zeros in the checkbook of the person who needs to pay for the people, the technology, the hardware, the support, and all of these things in order to meet to make zero downtime and zero data loss possible. Okay? And of course, budget. And I keep repeating budget because all of these require time, money, and resources. Writing a disaster recovery document takes time, especially if everybody loves writing documentation. Said no technical professional ever. I'll be honest, I don't like writing. I forced myself to write documentation because I didn't like writing documentation. I'd rather do the job and then forget about it. Let somebody else take care of the documentation. You need to budget for time, for money in writing documentation, and the people who need to test it. Like I said, writing documentation should be, if I hand this documentation to somebody in my operational team across the globe, they need to be able to follow step by step whatever is in the documentation so that they can invoke disaster recovery if and when necessary. And that takes time. It's interesting how many companies would have a DR plan with documentation, but they've never tested it ever. While it is good on paper, everything's perfect on paper until you start testing it. Like I said, in a real disaster, someone on the other side of the country or on the other side of the globe might be invoking DR, and they may have never seen the documentation before, looked at the infrastructure before, and now they're in a state of panic. Go back to the first framework, ignoring people, bypassing people. The people who would be invoking disaster recovery are not in the right state of mind, because for them this is a fight or flight situation that they've never dealt with before. And so when they deal with disaster recovery, it becomes not something like reading a documentation and invoking all of this, but rather somebody behind their backs asking, when is this coming back online? And the guy screaming. It's a lot worse than a drill instructor in the military. So for them, it really is not ideal. I had a healthcare services company back in, this was 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. They reached out to me, and they currently have an always-on availability groups stretch across 2 different data centers. In fact, their DR data center is actually Azure. They kind of outlined their existing architecture, something like this. It's a SQL Server 2016 Enterprise Edition with I can't remember how many replicas, but I'm using this as a guideline. Stretch clusters, multiple replicas across 2 different data centers, and they wanted to build a distributed availability group because they were constantly having outages caused by network connectivity issues between their production and their DR data center. And this is interesting because I started looking at their operational procedures, and there was only one question that I got them to think about. Do you have a DR escalation process? Again, crickets. I asked the question because they already have the infrastructure in place. They wanted to move to a more complicated infrastructure to meet both HA and DR requirements. But the one question that they have not, and it's interesting because this should be a part of their operational process, is that what happens when you have to invoke your DR? How is the process going to be? What they told me is a little bit surprising, because the same engineers that built the infrastructure are the ones that have to invoke the DR. And I said, well, are they on call 24/7? Yes. It's no wonder that their team was so tired and exhausted, not to mention that they're a healthcare services company, and of course during the pandemic there was an increase in the demand for using technology that deals with healthcare. And the fact that they don't have a DR escalation process is the reason why their staff. And I'm not talking about a one-person team here. I'm talking about a 5-person team, and every person on the team is exhausted. They're burnt out and they're tired. And the fact that they don't have a DR escalation process is what got them to face multiple outages. In fact, it's one of the reasons why they reached out to me, is because they keep getting outages after outages, and they needed that to stop. Right? I had to include technology here because HA and DR, okay, is primarily a people in a process thing, but you need the tools in order to achieve your high availability goals. When you focus more on tech, you tend to ignore other technologies. I call these creative technologies. Here's the reality. We fixate on tech a lot. Yes, we could do this with failover clustering, availability groups, replication. We geek out on the tech. But when we fixate on the tech, we tend to forget the only thing that matters. Availability groups are not it. Failover clustering is not it. Database mirroring, replication, log shipping, backups, dedupe on the storage level, that's not it. The only thing that matters is the goal. Why are you building a high availability solution in the first place? Why are you deploying an always-on availability group stretched across different data centers? Why are you incorporating availability groups with replication, with log shipping, with backups? Why are you doing all of this? Is it because you want to put that stuff on your resume and tell everybody that you managed to do that? You got to be clear on the goal. What is the goal? And when you focus on the goal, you have to define your operational procedures. Part of that is knowing, and I'll go back to the people and the process aspect. When you have a high availability solution, you need to define your operational procedure. The escalation procedure. Who will respond to a ticket when it comes in? Part of that is identifying how would the ticket flow throughout the operational process, from the issue creation, well, I don't want to say creation, but from the issue or the ticket creation up to issue resolution. How does that flow? You also need to look at monitoring. It is crazy how many infrastructures out there that I've seen where they have, I know it's a 2-node failover cluster with a 2-replica AG, but they don't have any monitoring in place. No monitoring. It's just like saying, I'm going to buy a very expensive car, but I'm not going to put on a fuel gauge, a speedometer, and I'm not going to do a temperature gauge. You need monitoring. It's a non-negotiable. Okay? You have to define your performance baselines, because how would you know that something isn't working the way it's supposed to be working when you don't have a baseline? It's interesting when somebody would say our availability group is slower when we introduce readable secondaries, and all of a sudden the applications are starting to slow. And I ask them, how slow? And again, crickets. If you cannot, it's again the same analogy. How do you know that you're overspeeding if you don't have a speed limit? How fast are you going? How slow are you going? You need to have a performance baseline. And then you implement the solution. Now, part of all of these, you might be wondering, so where does the technology come in? I emphasize on the concept of creative technologies because sometimes when we fixate on the tech and not on the goal, we tend to ignore the technologies that are available for you that could solve this, that could address the solution without introducing all of these complexities, without introducing additional confusion. Like for instance, if you haven't deployed a failover cluster in your entire career, you've never deployed a high availability solution, all of a sudden you're being told, now you take care of this. You haven't done it before, and so you get confused, and you don't have the training, so you get all the more scared about how to deal with it. Okay? And again, issue resolution and escalation. Part of this, and I wanted to share this case study of a software service company that I worked with a couple of years ago, and they wanted to do a lift and shift of an always-on available group to Azure. I'll just put the architecture there. It's a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica availability group, and they want to move their entire infrastructure to Azure. When they did the math, they were surprised about how expensive this has become. Yeah, a lot of people would talk about when you move to the cloud, it's going to be cheap. Your operational expenses are going to drop, your capital expenditures, but then they haven't done the math yet. So just doing a lift and shift from on-premises to Azure is going to cost more. Hint, hint, that's kind of like what it is actually. I'm not telling you not to move to the cloud. I'm just saying do the math and start thinking of creative technologies and not just doing something like a lift and shift. And I asked them, what was the original goal? When you built this 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG, what was the original goal? But we want a 3-node failover. And again, I asked the same question, what was the original goal? Did you build an AG because you wanted an AG? And it's interesting because I kind of use my strategy called the 5 whys. I keep asking the why question until I find the real reason why. Turns out that they built a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica availability group because they wanted high availability during the regular maintenance. And when I talk about maintenance, I talk about installing SQL Server updates, Windows updates, performing restarts, deploying code, servicing hardware, and so on and so forth. And they only need to do that once a month in a 4-hour window. And I was kind of surprised because they're basically telling me they built this massively large infrastructure with a 3-replica availability group just so they are fully covered for those 4 hours in a month. We ended up re-architecting this, moving to the cloud to take advantage of what the cloud can offer. But the thing is, because they were so focused on the tech, they forgot that there's more than just deploying the HA solution, why they did that in the first place. So you got to be very clear on the goal, because if you can achieve the goal without the current technology that you think can meet the goal, then you've achieved your goal. We tend to fixate on the technology because we think it's the only way to do it. And I kind of use the analogy of traveling. You can ride a bike, you can take the train, take the bus, drive, you can fly. First time I traveled in the United States, I thought those are the only options until I realized, oh, I didn't know that you could rent a car. It achieves the same goal. It's convenient. But because I was so fixated on what public transport do I need to use? Oh, I'm not from here. And I realized there are other options for me. I was so fixated on the tech, in that case, the mode of transportation, that I forgot my goal. My goal is to get to my destination fast, comfortably, with a lot of flexibility. And that's why it's important for you to really define a goal first. I did mention that I want to share with you the framework that I use. In fact, I've already given it away. I call this the Ppt Manifesto. Every time you become a part of an HADR project, you're deploying an HADR solution, you have to think of these 3 things. The first one is always start with the people. Always. These people, the human resource, would have the ideas, would have the experience, they have the capabilities, they have the creativity to come up with solutions down the road that you have not even thought of. Think of how they are going to support it down the road. Are they skilled enough? Are they capable enough? Are they trained enough? And do they have some experience about how to follow the process? Which leads me to the second one. Define the process. Building a high availability solution straightforward. Operating, maintaining, administering it down the road when it's already in production, you gotta have a process. What happens when a cluster dies? What happens when my databases become offline? What happens when we need to invoke DR? All of these need to be defined and written down. That way we're setting the right expectations and nobody's guessing. And nobody is trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? If there is a process in place and it is outlined and everybody knows how to deal with it and everybody's trained, going back to the people aspect, they know how to do what they need to do. Even with the documentation, give them the documentation, say follow all of these. Imagine if a surgeon would not have a process and a checklist when they're doing surgery. They might forget a pen inside their patient and stitch them up. Yes, we had a story like that from a couple of years ago. Some surgeon forgot a pen inside before stitching up the patient. It was just lucky that it happened on the other side of the globe where medical malpractice was not a, I don't want to say it's not a thing, but then, anyway, process, it is very, very important. And finally, technology. Choose the appropriate technology based on the goal. First, be very specific about the goal. Be very, very clear about the goal. And choose the technology that would help you, that would help the company achieve that goal. It may or may not be always on availability groups. It may or may not be failover clustering. It could be something else. And it could even be a technology that you know you can work with. It's not as complicated. You know, I might sound like somebody who's pushing people away from always on availability groups. No. I'm just in favor of choosing the right technology that would help you achieve your goal. And that's why like I said, I'm a big believer of the Ppt Manifesto, because it focuses more on the people and the process before choosing the right technology for your high availability solution. Okay, and that kind of summarizes this whole presentation on the 3 reasons why focusing on tech is the worst way to deploy. In general, it's not just SQL Server, and Francisco is right, the 5 why strategy fails or never fails, because I don't know, for me, I'm just curious though. Why do people do what they do? And sometimes we get sidetracked from the real goal. My job as a consultant is to make sure that I'm providing the guidance, the strategy, and the assistance to help you achieve your goal. Anything beyond that is useless, right? And like I said, I've seen people who would deploy an always-on availability groups, who would deploy an HA strategy without realizing they did not clarify the main goal. What's their recovery point? What's their recovery time objective? What's their SLA? Start with that. That is the main goal. Not the technology, not the feature that you need to use, not some fancy new feature that Microsoft's introducing, but what is the main goal? Because how good is the technology? How good is the solution if it's not meeting your needs? And that wraps up this presentation. And if, again, you need help with not just architecting your entire HA strategy or even designing a DR strategy, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. In the strategy session, I get people clear. Sometimes it's the decision maker, sometimes it's the DBA. And if the DBA does not have the answers to what is the real goal, it's not to build an availability group. It's not to build a failover cluster. What is the business goal? We get clear on what the real goal is, and if the strategy that you're willing to take on is the right strategy for you, then we will go ahead and work on it, and I'll help you achieve those. And if not, I'll steer you in the direction that would best serve your needs, with the goal of, number one, getting really clear on what you want to accomplish, and number two, achieving that goal. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have a conversation. Again, I'm not trying to dissuade people from using availability groups. Trust me, I love availability groups, but just because it's my preference doesn't mean it has to be your solution. Understanding what your real goals are and knowing how to achieve those goals are more important. And if that happens to be SQL Server high availability with failover clustering or availability groups, then so be it. If not, like I said, there are other creative technologies that you could leverage. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that chat, right? I look forward to having you on these strategy sessions. All right, and that is about it. Tune in again next week for another topic of conversation. And I kind of go back to some of the presentations that I did from the virtual chapters in the past, from the past summit, from other events, because in those presentations, there are questions that come up from people in the audience, and there are trends and patterns as to the struggles of what DBAs, sysadmins, IT professionals face whenever they're deploying SQL Server HA and DR solutions. So like I said, my goal is to make SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery practical. Something that you can take action on, and not just something that you know for the sake of knowing. Because like I said, how good is information if you're not taking action on it? I'll see you again next week for another topic. Francisco, it's great to have you here. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.